It's those moments. It's those moments. It's the moments where we come up against something that's really difficult in our life, and it can be with our career or our personal life, where we don't know if we can do it or not. There's an obstacle in front of us that might seem insurmountable, and we have fear and anxiety, and we don't know if we can do it. And then there comes a point where we decide that we're going to cringe forward, that we're going to do what we can to move past that fear, that anxiety, to be able to move from a human being to a human becoming. And today I have Tiffany with me, and she is going to share a little bit about who she is and what she does and how she cringed forward in her life. Welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So I know that I met you through the Facebook Community Leaders Accelerator Program, and you have a community called Diversability. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so Diversability, we are on a mission to elevate disability pride. Excuse me. And we do that through a disability community, increasing visibility of our community, and engaged allyship. And I came into this community because it was what I so desperately needed as a kid.
Mm.
For those who are unfamiliar with my story, at the age of 9, I was involved in a car accident. I permanently paralyzed one of my arms. My dad unfortunately passed away. Much later, I'd be diagnosed with PTSD. And I just felt so alone as a 9-year-old in this experience that
Mhm.
12 years later of not telling anyone about the car accident, wearing long sleeves all the time, not really grieving the loss of my dad, I was like, I want to find my people. And so 2009 was 1.0 or negative 1.0 or 0.0 of Diversability. And now it's grown into this, ecosystem of almost 70,000.
And I love how you advocate for visibility and that it's called Diversability, because one thing that I didn't realize before joining your community is that some disabilities aren't visible. And, it can be a neurological thing or a psychological thing, or it can be a variety of different things. And I think the first thing that a lot of people think about is a physical disability.
Yeah,
And yeah.
there's a stat out there that says that about 70% of disabilities are not apparent. So that means if
Mm.
you're, heading down the sidewalk, chances are you wouldn't be able to tell someone's disability. I mean, even in a virtual environment now, unless I told you that my arm was paralyzed, I could technically present as a non-disabled
I
person.
didn't know that. I did not know. I'd known you for 2 years, and, since December 2020, and it wasn't until I started following you more recently on TikTok where you were showing examples of what you did to be able to adapt every day of life activities. I knew this
Yeah.
was important to you, but I didn't know it was a personal story, so
Yeah,
that's a great example right
yeah.
there.
I mean, I think in addition to that, though, the fact that I live with a mental health condition or a mental health disorder or disability, the PTSD, that is also a disability. And so I think oftentimes we'll have people who have different types of chronic illnesses or different mental health disabilities or mental health conditions who say, "Oh, like, does this count?" And the answer is yes, right? And so much of our work is, in that fake word diversability, is that disability is diverse. There is no look for what it looks like.
Mhm.
And it is also a part of diversity. And so there's kind of like a double meaning in that word.
I love that because that's what it is, and I know that you've shared a lot about what ableism means. Can you tell me a little bit and us a little bit more about that so that we can understand that a little bit better?
Yeah, so the easiest way that most people understand ableism is disability discrimination, but it's actually
Mm.
much more deeply rooted than that. And so Talia Lewis and Dustin Gibson, who are two incredible disability justice activists that I would recommend people follow, they describe ableism as a system of oppression that places value and worth on one person's body and or mind over another. And the
Ooh.
reason why I mentioned body and our mind, right? Body is the visible manifestation of my disability. The mind is, my mental health condition, right? So when we place value and worth over one person over another, and then there's an asterisk that says, you actually don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. So when we
Mm.
distill ableism down to disability discrimination, as most of us understand it, then we're like, oh, this doesn't apply to me. But when we start to think about how media and advertising have treated women's bodies, or how many of us have come to confront our own anti-black racism, or how we or our treatment of black bodies. That's an example of ableism intersectionally combined with, from a women's perspective, sexism, and from a black perspective, like a race, the intersections of disability and race as well.
Oh, totally. And we had someone that said that they love that definition of ableism. I do too, because it's not as narrow. It's a lot more inclusive, just like everything else is. And I know when I joined your community, I thought, oh, well, I'm doing this so I can know how to be a better advocate, how to be able to add more diversity, more inclusivity in the language that I use and the people that I work with. And then, and then I'm like, oh, I guess this is me too. Because, I'm not neurotypical, and, my 4 children are not neurotypical either. And I was like, oh, so this is something that applies to me. And when I started reading some of the stories of people and examples and questions they had about what they could do to better advocate for themselves in their job or in school or in their community, and the responses from other people who had said, hey, I've gone through this, this is what I've done, it really was reaffirming to me to be able to know that, hey, one, this isn't something that I'm the only person that experiences. And two, that there is a solution and a way to be able to advocate better and make that more visible.
Yeah, and actually what you just shared, Jen, is the whole reason why I started this group. Because so the group is mixed between non-disabled people and disabled people, and we actually have a lot of non-disabled people who join, or people who have non-visible disabilities. Maybe they have ADHD or are dyslexic, and they join, and maybe they haven't really grasped that they are part of the disability community. And then, as a function of seeing not only how positive the group is, but how everyone's just showing up for each other, then they're like, hey, I actually want to be proud to be part of this community. And so one of the things that one of the things that I'm proud of in that Facebook community is the longtime lurkers of people who they join because maybe they're not necessarily ready to join a disability only group, but then,
Mhm.
as a function of being there, they say, wait, this applies to me too, and I want to be loud and proud and part of this community and help advocate for myself and other people like me too.
Now, that brings up a great point. Have you ever felt challenged when you tell your story, or have you ever had any pushback at all from people with your advocacy for the disabled community?
Have I ever had any push on a daily basis? I have pushback.
Yeah, tell us more.
I mean, one of the things I often highlight is that, okay, again, disability is diverse, right? Diversability. And so our community isn't a monolith. So I can go out and say, and so part of how we humanize the disability experience is we can say, there are some of us who feel really comfortable talking about our disabilities, and there are some of us who don't, right? For every
Right.
X, there is a Y. And I think that so much of the disability experience, whether it's through stereotypes, other things like that, we end up assuming that the disability experience is only one type of thing. It can only be tragic. Our lives are only sad. We are all unemployed, and so as we continue, like, so much of my work is like, how can we break some of that, not only that bias, but some of those stereotypes? Because the number of people who have come to me who say, Tiffany, I don't consider you as disabled. And what's
Mm,
interesting is I actually have a physical disability, right? And so I imagine the amount of, whether you call it gaslighting or non-believers of people who have non-visible disabilities, the fact that I literally can show you something. I mean, you've seen my TikTok,
right.
and how I've had to learn how to navigate and adapt, um,
So,
makes me feel
and I think that's a great point, because I know that happens a lot when it comes to race or religion or other things too, because that language that we use, I believe that words have power.
Mhm.
And since someone discounts your experience and they're like, I don't perceive you as that, and that's part of how you identify yourself, that's like a whole other thing in and of itself too.
Yeah, but
So,
and it ends up becoming like, I end up using energy, and it becomes exhausting to try to prove something. Um,
right.
and in a way, the I don't see you as disabled, like, that's what we would call like an ableist microaggression. So it's unintentional, right? Because I think in that person saying, "Oh, I don't see you as disabled," they're really saying like, I see disability as this sad thing and you're not that. But
Mm.
I don't know, I wanna challenge people to sit in the contradictions that I'm disabled and I can thrive and I can have a job and build in an 100% disabled team. But I think to your point about, if I've received any pushback, I mean, I think on a daily basis, sometimes I feel nervous logging into social media or checking my email for the next person who's angry at something. We had a couple of our community members interviewed for a piece around Halloween around not to use disability as or physical disabilities as a Halloween costume, and people were
Right?
like, "Don't mess with Halloween! Like you're ruining this for everyone." And I just like, there are certain people in the community who understand that when we vilify disability as Halloween costumes, we further perpetuate this narrative that like disability is evil or it's only the villain or it's so othered or outcast,
Or
And
that it's humorous somehow to be able to change the way we look or to act a certain way because it almost creates like a caricature
yeah.
of a
And I
fun.
think that, I think there's part of me that like wants to explore more like improv and acting stuff and like getting out of my body because because I don't know, I think that's just how we expand our comfort zones. Like I feel very comfortable in my disabled body, but I'm curious like what if I did more dance or more movement, and um
And I've
anyway,
seen people use and I've seen, I can't think of his last name right now. His name is Josh, and he's got cerebral palsy, and he's a stand-up comedian. And so he uses humor to be able to educate and to be able to make something that can a lot of times be a really thing that people take very seriously to bring some levity into it. So
yeah.
I think that the way that we share it um, can really make a difference too, but it's what we feel comfortable, like you said before.
Yeah. I mean, I will say Emily Ladau, who's another really great disability advocate, she has this saying where she says, in order to make the world more accessible, we need to make the disability experience more accessible to the world. And I
Ooh.
and I think about that a lot. So there are some people, we're not entitled to tell anyone anything about our medical history or our disabilities. Like that's our privilege to determine whether or not we share it. But but I think so much of my work is this idea that if we make our experience more accessible to non-disabled people or to people who don't yet consider themselves to be in the disability community, they can see that there's actually a rich culture and history and pride here that you may want to create a sense of affinity or belonging to, right? I think in the past, we've always viewed disability as this group of people that we don't want to be part of. But then when
Mhm.
you're like, there's actually like, even in my own like Asian American identity, like there's culture and history there. And we've got movies and music and art and all this stuff. And we have the same with like disabled musicians and actors and artists and all this stuff. So it's very rich. And I think when we diminish how rich the disability community is, then we stop being aspirational.
Right, and I love that too, that you brought up a great point, that there's not just one physical thing about a person too, because you've got the other component of your racial identity that's combined in that, or the way that people identify you by your physical body again. So that's another thing that may set you apart from the whatever, white people.
Well, just the fact that this community isn't a monolith, right? And there's, I have in my LinkedIn headline that I'm on a mission to increase intersectional disability representation. And I used to get
Mm.
a lot of messages from people being like, what is disability intersectionality? What's in intersectional disability? I don't understand that. And then Microsoft actually came out with this great video. I actually have it linked on my LinkedIn profile. And so, disability intersectionality is this idea that our lived experience of disability is impacted by our different identities. So, a good example is
Ooh, yeah.
I
Okay,
know,
go for it.
I know. This is where it gets rich, but this is where we highlight, like, you know, um, you, Jen, white presenting woman, has a non-visible disability if you decide you belong to our community or not. And you live in, I think you said Idaho.
Oh, I live in the middle of nowhere, like 2,000 or 2 hours away from the nearest Chick-fil-A or big box store or fast
Oh
food
my gosh.
restaurant.
Well,
Very
now
rural.
I want Chick-fil-A.
Right?
Uh,
The market fresh salad with the apple cider vinaigrette is my absolute favorite, so
um, But yeah, so I want to share. So I'm the daughter of Asian immigrants. Like my dad is from Taiwan, my mom born and raised in Vietnam during the war. And within their culture, visible disabilities were meant to be hidden away. And
Mm.
so for 12 years, so part of this reason why I kind of shared at 9 years old, and then 12 years later, I had this aha moment and wanted to start this community. For 12 years, I didn't tell anyone about the car accident. And a lot of that was very heavily influenced by the way I grew up as the daughter of Asian immigrants. And so I know a lot of other people who have similar injuries who were supported in different ways by their family, and I think for me, those 12 years were all enshrined in shame, right? I mean, this is like the cringe forward, right? I cringed at the fact that my arm looked different, that my hand looked different, that it was short, that around my body. And in a way, I actually just rejected it for those 12 years. I wore long sleeves all the time. For anyone who has lived on the East Coast, long sleeves in the summer is just like you don't want to do it, but I did it. I did it. But that's a way that like disability intersectionality comes into play because there are uh, ethnic cultural dynamics that influenced how I viewed my own disability, and that
Mhm.
kind of created this ripple effect. And now I have spent, the last 13 years, I've been disabled for 25 years now. I spent the last 13 years kind of building this community, but the beginning of building Diversability really paralleled my own story, which is like, I don't know if anyone cares about hearing my story. And then I was like, why did I diminish the fact that I matter as a human being just like anyone else for so long?
Was there a certain moment that you decided, "Hey, I'm gonna cringe forward through this? I've kind of hidden, if you will, this part of who I am and my identity, and it's more important for me to be able to share who I am and my message with other people in my story."
Yeah, I feel like people are always looking for this light bulb moment where I'm like, one day I woke up and then I was like, I'm going to share this story. But I mean, I call myself an accidental disability advocate, an accidental community builder, and an accidental entrepreneur. And I say accidental because I remember, so actually, I do remember the day. It was October 22nd, 2009. And I had been invited to speak on this student panel around, disability advocacy on campus at my university. And I had never been invited to be on a panel like this before. So this was my first time speaking publicly about disability. And so I shared the story of the car accident. And I remember I shared that story through tears. And
Mhm.
for me, one of the things I talk a lot about in my work is what's the difference between oversharing versus vulnerability. And,
Yes.
the oversharing side is like, I have a professional private support system that I can turn to for hard things to heal through, to then be able to show up vulnerably in public spaces and share my story with confidence and grace and show you kind of the arc of everything that happened. But I think back to that October date because I think I shared my story before I was ready. And that is maybe my cringe forward moment is sometimes you got to do things before you're ready. And the fascinating thing is, so we just launched like a subgroup of Diversability called the Diversability Leadership Collective. It's much smaller, doesn't have 5,000 members like our Facebook community does. And so we've been talking among our team of like, oh, like the engagement is low. And I remember hanging up those flyers, those Diversability flyers on campus in 2009, and nobody was a part of Diversability except for me. I was Diversability's biggest hype woman,
You
and
were it. You were the member, and that was
I was the only one. And what was fascinating at that time, oh, and I don't think you know this story, was I reached out to two other like disabled students that I knew on campus, and I said, hey, like I noticed that there isn't a student club on campus that serves like that, serves students with disabilities, like our fellow peers. And both of them ghosted. I don't know if they saw, I mean, I would see them in person and I was like, in a way, I was like, can you respond to the email? But I kind of like read between the lines, which was,
Mhm.
hey, I'm not that excited about this. And so I was a party of one, but honestly, I think because I had spent those 12 years being so alone, I just
The
was
need
like,
for that community was bigger. And you talked about sharing your story, and that's what I help people do as a personal brand strategist is I help them tell their story. Because it can be cringy and uncomfortable to be like, look, this is who I am, and to lay yourself vulnerable and emotionally bare there. And there are some stories in my personal life that I don't share on camera or on social media or anything like that because I need to kind of work through the reason behind, and I would be doing the ugly cry if I share them. But I
Yeah.
do believe it takes that one moment to say, okay, this is who I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I might get pushback and everything, and it's hard, but you still cringe forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a talk by Brene Brown. She's kind of like my spirit animal.
Yep,
Um,
I'm taking one of her classes right now, like to get
oh,
through the
awesome.
introduction.
Well, I mean, when her talk about shame resilience, it talks about shame festers in secrecy, silence, and judgment. And I
Mhm.
had 12 years of that secrecy, silence, and judgment. And what I noticed was that the first time I shared, it was very vulnerable, like very soft, tender heart moment. But that the more that I shared it, the less that I felt like I was re-experiencing it while I was sharing it, right? And so there's also,
Right.
back on the oversharing versus vulnerability, there's a difference between retelling a story versus reliving a story. And how can we figure out what that distinction is so that we're not reliving something hard when we retell it? I don't know,
You
maybe
don't
there's
want
too
that
much
trauma.
nuance there.
No, yeah, I totally get that because it's like you don't wanna re-traumatize yourself with reliving that experience
Yeah, and I
because
think there's a
it's
lot of
hard.
healing work, right? I get so many questions that are like, "Tiffany, how are you so confident and loud and proud about your disability?" And I was like, "I will never forget those 12 years of feeling invisible and that I didn't matter." And I believe that all of us exist in a band. So if we have experiences where we felt like we were invisible and didn't matter, the other side of that band is that we matter more than anything in the world, even if it's to just ourselves or that one other person. And so I think that again, when I talk about humanizing the disability experience, it's how can we view everything about the human experience in terms of a band? We can exist in these contradictions where, yes, I've been through something really difficult. Sometimes when I watch old videos of myself, I cry. I'm like, I can't believe that 9-year-old girl had to go through that stuff, and it's really and I feel really heartbroken that she had to go through that. And then I'm like, but how did she become me, right? But I think the lesson here is, those first couple of times will feel very sensitive potentially. But as you start to share it more, like I think what ended up happening every time after I shared that story, afterwards someone would come to me and they would say, I really resonated with this part, or I have a family member who XYZ, or my other loved one. And I was like, there are more people who need to hear this so that they have permission to know that their stories matter too.
Your voice has value, your message has meaning, and you deserve to be seen and heard. And that's my whole thing. And if your story has value because of the impact it can make on other people, not just the confidence that it builds in you to be able to share who you are with the world and on social media, it's the power that it has to be able to change other people. And even if it's one person, because I believe, like Gandhi said, that one person can make a difference, it's such a powerful thing. So now how can people join the diversability community or help support you and your advocacy work that you're doing?
Sure. Well, I have a non-diversability thing that I'm working on, which is we are currently fundraising for a disability empowerment endowed fund.
Mhm.
This one will exist at Georgetown, but it's an endowment fund. And so what that means is that once we're able to raise the full amount, I think we've raised 65K of the 100K. So we're close, but it's like if anyone wants to donate 35K, I would be I would be very welcome. But once that gets funded, we never need to fundraise for it again. It exists in perpetuity. And so part of the
Mm.
reason why I wanted to share this is because um, what in perpetuity of this endowment means is now this university, and this is like how what systemic change looks to me in my spheres of influence, is that once it's funded, that means that Georgetown, which is where I went to school, will have to invest in disability initiatives forever. And that also means that Disability Matters from an economic financial perspective forever, and the hope is that the fund will continue to grow. If anyone is familiar with investments, hold for a long time and, you'll see some return. So that's number one. If you have the means, would love any donations to the Disability Empowerment Endowed Fund. But if people want to join Diversability, just like Jen did, we have this amazing Facebook community. It's got about 5,000 members in it. It's very active, people asking questions, sharing resources. We recently had someone, there was a thread in there recently that was like, hey, I unfortunately got COVID. Does anyone have any recommendations of TV shows or movies that I should binge? And it's got like 27 comments on it. And anyone can like respond to that. And then we also have a lot of non-disabled allies kind of come into that group as well. And they're like, hey, I'm still learning how to talk about disability, but I want to figure out, how can I make my live stream the most accessible for, people who have different types of disabilities? That's a question that we've seen before as well.
And I think too, like as someone that specializes in marketing and online marketing, if you have any control or power over what you're creating for clients, encouraging them to be more inclusive in their print media and the way that they're presenting it on social media is huge.
Yeah. I think the one thing or one of the many things I want to remind people is that when you do that, there are actually humans who benefit from it. So I think oftentimes when we think about accessibility, we're like, oh, I have to caption this thing or I have to write these image descriptions. But then you're like, but wait, like there are all of these people who can now access my content who weren't able to before. And this is what makes me excited about like LinkedIn Live and YouTube, I think, and even Facebook Live, like they'll put all of these captions on as well. But I also do want to share outside of the Facebook community, we have launched a sub community more specifically focused on disability leadership. And so if you are disabled and looking for support, we've got a good mix of people who, work in the corporate world or are looking to become more outspoken advocates and looking for more visibility. We kind of have like a little incubator space called the Diversability Leadership Collective that you can check out.
I love it. And we'll make sure that we put the links down in the comments so that people can reach out to you directly or support you in what it is that you're doing, because it's such an important thing. And I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for being a supporter. And, I always think about, these types of conversations. And I want to remind people that Jen and I didn't meet yesterday. We've been in each other's spheres for multiple years now, following each other's work. I think we were both part of the Community Leaders Association when it was. And so just like continue to like, so much of why I created Diversability is like, the fact that Jen and I have this relationship over 2 years and hopefully many more is I want other disabled people to know that they can start to build their own networks that have value and worth in them too.
Oh, definitely. And when I decided, okay, I was going to have these cringe forward conversations, you were one of the first people that came to mind. And because of you showing up authentically as your true self online. And that's part of why I've built this Cringe Forward community now, so that it's a place where people can gather on social media, and that we have a private Facebook community where people can show up, cringe and all, and show the content that they're creating, go live. So it's a safer environment. So it's not necessarily something that they're doing for their business out there, and they can feel a little bit more confident and comfortable and have that encouragement. Because like you mentioned before, there's those trolls in the comment and the people that will show up, and you're like, you're already feeling uncomfortable and awkward being out there and putting yourself out there authentically and not showing the airbrush version of who you are in your life. But that adds a complexity to it. So I'm really excited to be able to do that. And for me,
I'm so excited for what you're building. Follow Jenna on TikTok if you're not already. There's some great content coming on there. But yeah, I was telling Jen before we went live, she's like, I'm pushing myself out of my comfort zone to do these lives. And I'm like, this is how we grow.
Mm-hmm.
This is how we grow.
It totally is. And it came to a point just like with you where I was like, what I have to say and the value I have to add is bigger than my fear. And I know that I can help one person at least out there that needs to be able to hear that their voice has value, their message has meaning, and they deserve to be seen and heard. So thank you so much, Tiffany. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So on Friday, we're going to talk to Shahara Wright, and she is an attorney that specializes in business law, especially with trademark and things around that. And she's going to share a little bit more about her journey to be an attorney and take a non-traditional path of being in a larger firm and being practicing as an individual. Have a fantastic week. And you can learn more at cringeforward.com about the community that I'm building. I'll put a link to that as well in the comments.